Hello there, welcome to Nerd.World History and my continuation of my exploration of all the indigenous, or at least local, Celtic tribes of the British Isles, including the Isle of Alba and Hibernia, otherwise generally broadly known as Britannia, and who were the Celts before the Romans turned up, each individual tribe, an exploration of each one of them. Today we're looking at, and I may be butchering this pronunciation, and Google, trust me, is no help on this, the Novantae, I think. The Novantae. They were a Scottish tribe that lived in the southern Scotland, in the lowland areas on the peninsula. Before we get started, please like, share, subscribe, and comment down below. Now, early sources for this tribe, of course, come from the Romans, who note them, particularly certain Roman authors that came here, they noted them as living on a small peninsula outcropping from across the northern border into Caledonia, which would be eventually Scotland, basically the northern parts of Britannia, a freestanding Celtic tribal people who were mostly an agricultural society. Unfortunately, historians, archaeologists have not heavily excavated their settlements, so we don't actually have much in the way of direct archaeological evidence for them. And unlike other Celtic tribes such as the Votadini, who were the tribe who were basically right on the other side of Hadrian's Wall, more or less, but they bordered the Novantae, they didn't really build massive hill forts or other giant monuments. And that's not to say they didn't build them, they just didn't seem to build very many of them, and the ones they did build, when the Pictish culture took over the area, they built on top of them. So what you see is mostly the remains of larger Pictish settlements and monuments and temples and things that have come after them. That said, it shouldn't be that they didn't exist. They certainly did, but they were predominantly an agricultural, and as a result, it can be believed, a relatively peaceful people. If they didn't need to maintain any kind of large fortifications or feel a need to show off to their neighbours in any monumental way, this means one of two things. They were either very poor and couldn't do it, which is not likely, or they simply didn't prioritize that in their day-to-day lives and didn't feel directly threatened by their neighbours, at least not to the degree where they felt that they needed large-scale fortifications or a standing army. Not that Celts really had those, but they did have warrior elites that probably more akin to a medieval knight, at least in concept. They certainly had established nobility. They had chieftains that were types of kings. They had, let's say, nobles. They had lords. They had merchant classes, peasant classes, even slaves, and of course, as I mentioned, the warrior class, who took over most of the military activity that would be involved in that particular tribe. But this tribe didn't seem to demonstrate any particularly hostile or aggressive nature, and it was nothing referenced by the Romans. There's no evidence that they really fought against the Romans, although it's likely that they did at least support the conflict against the Romans, as there was one large-scale unification after the conquest of southern Britannia by the Romans. It sort of galvanized the remaining tribes in the north to coalesce into the Picts. But before that, they had their own equivalent of Karaticus, a man who unified the peoples of the remaining free peoples of the north, very Lord of the Rings there, against the Romans, galvanizing them. Now, these people, as I said, they did build hill forts, but they seem to have been taken over by the Picts later. They lived in roundhouses like everyone else, and they did have this rather nice jewellery that I think, this sort of torque, which dates from the 2nd century, which comes from their area and may have been made by them. But other than that, there isn't much in the way of, they didn't leave much behind. As I said, the main references to them come from the Romans. The first proper reference to them is about 150 AD, when Ptolemy, in his geography, references them as living in the southwesternmost point of the area above Hadrian's Wall, roughly the area of Galloway now, up in Scotland. And that's really about the only major reference. He does make references to some settlements and major bases. There has also been some, as I said, not much, but some excavations, including a fortified farmstead which was occupied from something like 200 BC to about 100 AD. The tribe generally did build some as did many up in the sort of northern parts of Britain. They built something known as a dun, and I may be butchering that, so I apologise. Dun is how it's basically spelled, but I think it's pronounced dun. And it's basically a sort of, it's not quite a broch, but what it is basically a very, very high, very thick stone circular wall. It probably didn't have a roof on it and was used as a sort of Celtic fort, is what I want to say. I'm sure they had many other uses and had other purposes to their existence, some of which may even have been ritualistic, but on a practical level they were good for defense. Thick walls, relatively high, useless really against the Romans with their siege weapons and stuff, but against the Celtic army, pretty well defended, very easily defensible. And there were several of these in the area of where the Novantae did exist. They were also referenced a number of years later by the English writer Bede, who referenced them as being a Brythonic-speaking Gallic culture, the Novantae, and as also as a Pictish culture. As I said, so they did still exist well into the post-Roman period, but references to them do start to dwindle off over the successive years due to changes of leadership up in Scotland, basically Viking invasions, Irish invasions, English invasions, as well as internal changes of power within the country. Eventually the old order of the old Celtic kingdoms eventually would disappear and be replaced by a larger Pictish nation, and then later by the Scottish nation. So there is the brief basic history of them. There is a few contradictory pieces of information about them generally, which I'll quickly cover, and basically they disappear after the Roman occupation, more or less. They're referenced in poetry, they're referenced in a few bits of, as I say, writings, such as the writings of Bede a bit later. They were mentioned a lot during the Roman period, and they were referenced by early campaigners for the conquest of Britain, and later ones even mentions. There was no mention of them by Tacitus, but apparently Agricola, the man who was responsible for a lot of the conquest in Britain, would actually reference them. It's also very likely they would have been encountered by Antoninus, as he led an army north. Other than that, everything else would be probably relatively apocryphal, as there isn't much in the way of, these people didn't write anything down, so it's hard to say. But there we have them. A relatively obscure, and I thought they were kind of interesting. I thought they needed a bit of a shine putting on them, just on the basis of we know so little about them. The only real information we have about them is all secondhand from Roman authors, from English authors. No one else seems to mention them, but they definitely existed, and they shouldn't be forgotten. They were clearly a peaceful people and didn't need to have large fortifications and military activity at all times, and that should be maybe the goal. Either way, like, share, subscribe, comment down below. Have you heard of them? Do you live in that area of the world, and do you know who your ancestors were living there? And if there's any bits of information I have missed out about them, tell me in the comments below, because I'm sure there's something, because I couldn't find much on them, and I found it intriguing that I couldn't find much on them. You can find quite a bit on some of the other tribes from what is now Scotland, but only because they had direct contact with the Romans. These people had little to no contact with the Romans, aside from superficial contact, maybe a bit of trade, a few Roman emissaries going up there. They were neither ally nor enemy, and they were kind of neutral. But if you made it all the way to the end of the video, thank you for watching, and bye bye.